Okay, welcome to this show on politics and philosophy, hosted by the Norwegian political journal Røyst. Røyst is based in Bergen, Western Norway, and explores politics, culture, philosophy globally and also locally. My name is Eirik, and I'm honored to have with me today John Milbank, English theologian, philosopher, co-founder of the radical orthodoxy movement, and emeritus professor at the University of Nottingham, where he leads the Center of Theology and Philosophy. Milbank is known for the book Theology and Social Theory, and also he co-authored The Politics of Virtue, this book right here, which is a kind of, I think, a very good way into post-liberal thought in general. And so today we're going to speak about post-liberalism, trying to introduce it to the Norwegian audience in general, but of course everybody who are, it's global also since it's YouTube. But John, thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's a real pleasure, Ira.
Okay, for the Norwegians, who I think most Norwegians don't know that much about post-liberal thought, so for the Norwegians, perhaps I want to start with the question, what is post-liberalism?
Well, perhaps not everybody would give the same answer, but I suppose one clue lies in the post word, that it's not so much an anti-liberalism as a feeling that liberalism is insufficient. Defining liberalism here, at least as a term of art, liberalism can mean lots of different things, but I think in this context, what it means is a political philosophy beginning with the individual, but assuming that the prime unit, the prime relevant political actor is the undefined individual with no assumptions about the nature of that individual, and essentially a historical approach, if you like. And the argument would be that even though we talk about liberal society, liberal democracy, and so on, that perhaps up to recently we haven't had completely naked, unqualified liberalism. That we live in within a particular European legacy that has its roots in Athens and Jerusalem and Rome. And from that legacy, certain more concrete human assumptions and aims of human life follow, so that up till recently, one could say there hasn't been pure liberalism. There's been a very strong influence of the churches, of cultural tradition, assumptions, shared assumptions about morality, how you should live your life. And as those have more and more eroded, perhaps mainly with the decline of religion, we do seem to have entered an era of pure liberalism, in which the only values are then individual freedom of choice on the one hand, and something like utility and convenience on the other hand. In terms of ideas about utility and convenience, I don't think it's an accident that in recent years science seems to have assumed more and more public authority as a last course of appeal, as what we can all agree about. It seems to be objective, and it seems to be linked to making life easier, more convenient, happier, and so on. And so besides utility, we've simply got this notion of individual rights and maximizing individual freedom of choice. and that seems to be a consensus across both right and left. On the right, maybe you argue that we can only have complete liberty if we have the pure rule of the markets. On the left, say in Rawlsian terms, the argument tends to be more, well, people must have equal ability to compete, and people have disadvantages of birth and fortune, and the state has to try to level that up a bit. But the same idea in the end, that we're maximizing individual freedom of choice, and that a lot of competition is involved in that. So often the left is talking about freedom of opportunity, not equality of opportunity, not so much equality of outcomes in the way that they used to do. And once you've got this idea that the only value is individual rights and a kind of measurable improvement in the utility of human life, then what can mediate between individuals who are seen to be originally isolated from each other? And roughly speaking, it's only economic contract on the one hand, or bureaucratic control on the other hand. And so the left tends to favor bureaucratic control. The right tends to favor market mediation. And then in reality, of course, we get mixes between the two. And a further difference between the left and the right is that the right tends to stress economic liberty, but is more culturally conservative, perhaps because it balks at the idea of pure anarchy. And I think the left makes the opposite move. The left tends to espouse a cultural freedom of choice, prioritizes the individual over the family and the community, and so forth. But again, perhaps balks at the idea of pure anarchy. So maybe we can think of Scandinavia here, or at least say of Sweden, where in some ways people are very isolated as individuals, but there's a shared consensus about the state helping you, the element of solidarity is, as it were, auctioned off to the state, but it's still there. But in a sense, you could argue that both the left and the right are inconsistent. They're both basically liberal, but they don't have the total courage of their liberal convictions. And in reality, what we've had ever since the 60s, 70s, 80s is an increasing drift towards a cultural left combined with an economic right. So I suppose a key position of post-liberalism is that we need to redefine where the big political division lies, that it's not necessarily a left-right division so much as it is a liberal communitarian division. And we've lost sight of a communitarian modification of liberalism. And I suppose post-liberalism is wanting to reassert that. In Britain, for example, you could find parallels in America and Europe. You had, ever since T.H. Green in the 19th century, had the phenomenon of new liberalism, where there was something of a sense that, pure negative liberty of the individual wasn't enough, that you need the material conditions to be free. And also, to some degree, you need to understand that certain ways of life, desirable ways of life, make you freer than others, that you can become enslaved to bad motivations, addicted to bad things, so there's that kind of Platonic, classical, Aristotelian elements coming through in that legacy. And I think that legacy remained quite powerful in Britain up till 1945, the emergence of the welfare state and so on. That was in some ways a fusion of socialist traditions with new liberal traditions, but that after the 60s and after Thatcher, you lost sight entirely of that sort of legacy, so that at the very least, the post-liberal position is arguing, okay, we're not going to agree about everything. Sometimes you have to mediate differences by formal rules, by agreeing to differ and saying, you can do your thing in your space and I'll do my thing in my space. But I think a crucial argument here is that there are strict limits to that. I mean, even if you think in sort of geographic terms, I do what I like in my house and garden, but my garden overlooks other people. I get the same air and the same birds crossing. We share the air. The houses are on a common street, and we have to come to some sort of decision about what the street looks like, how we treat the air crossing over us. And you soon get into an area where perhaps you're thinking beyond simply live and live. You're asking about what values do we share in common. And for example, a sense of the value of wild nature or preserving the legacy of the past would be examples of this. I think it's not an accident that in Britain, the public corporations that are to do with that, things like the National Trust, even the BBC, that is in a way about ensuring a good public information and cultural sphere. I think it's not an accident that those institutions are now in trouble, because I think they assume some kind of consensus about the common good and about the nature of human flourishing. And the more that has gone by the board, the more people think that the good is just a matter of individual choice, the more they've tended to collapse. But what we're discovering is that without a considerable consensus, liberal politics doesn't actually work any longer. That parliamentary democracy actually assumes we have fundamental agreements about many things, and we have then civilized disputes about the margins of disagreement. But increasingly, it seems that kind of consensus is totally breaking down, especially in America. So the post-liberal case would be that pure liberalism, trying to deal with everything by a set of formal rules without any substantive agreement, whether we're talking about the market or we're talking about state bureaucracy. And it's not an accident that we've got such a proliferation of laws in recent years. With the absence of cultural consensus, nobody trusts anybody, and so you have to do all this endless, terrible safeguarding business and checking up on everybody all the time. But the case would be that this actually doesn't work. And increasingly, people have a sense it doesn't work, and a sense that crime and disorder are rising. For example, people don't trust different ethnic communities. And then inevitably you get the rise of Caesarism, of which I think Trump is a symptom, a turn to something very authoritarian. Mainly because there's a sense you need a strong person to keep order, and maybe it's the same in China and in the USSR. And some critics of post-liberal thinkers, and I think the initial ones were in Britain, Philip Blond, Adrian Pabst, myself emerging from radical orthodoxy, and then in parallel in the States, various American Catholics, and most notably Patrick Deneen, thinking along sort of independent but rather parallel lines. And I think there's a tendency now to, particularly in America, to blame Patrick and Adrian Vermeulen and people like him because you're getting the emergence of the truly nasty, something that seriously is half Nazi and racist and so on. And this seems to be basically unfair because I think rather the post-liberals were warning, they were warning that there will be a liberal fascist dialectic, that it will be a bit like Weimar, indeed. And Rod Dreher's not totally wrong about that, even if I don't agree with him about a lot of things. But that sort of Weimar phenomenon, that you're going to get a fascistic reaction against pure liberalism, particularly because the left seems to have forgotten the socialist tradition, which you can argue is inherently more conservative. Even in its Marxist version, Marx saying, capitalism means all that is solid melts into air. It erodes, the most basic human norms. And in some ways, communist societies have been quite conservative. But the more the left has drifted to liberalism, the more I think it tends to provoke fascism. And it is very dialectical that because liberalism makes everything a matter of technique and procedure, then that can be captured by very authoritarian tendencies, who then associate that with virulent nationalism. I mean, the only thing I would say is that I do think that the identification of post-liberalism in America simply with the politics of the right has been inherently dangerous. That in Britain, mainly it's been a left conservatism, more like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany or Jean-Paul Macaire in France. It's mainly been a sort of economic egalitarianism plus a qualified, not very extreme kind of cultural conservatism, basically pro encouraging the traditional family, but fully accepting not everybody fits into that, shall we say, let's put it that way. But certainly protesting that in effect we have anti-marriage and anti-family policies, and that these affect the working class particularly badly. So I think left conservatism has been the mark of the British mode of post-liberalism. And even where we have Philip Blond and various people taking a more Tory line, it's very much red Toryism in that kind of Canadian tradition of very much wanting to at least qualify the capitalist market in a more communitarian sort of direction, and sort of openly embracing a certain measure of paternalism, if you like, a benign paternalism. Whereas I think moving to the right, identifying post-liberalism on the right in America can be dangerous. The Republican Party is so committed, for a very long time to the free market, that you tend to get sucked back into that, and also sucked into a cult of. I mean, if capitalism has now mutated so that it's something like deregulation in one country, neoliberalism in one country, something like that, you then also get sucked into nationalism and the cult of the leader, and the tendency within American post-liberalism, despite beginnings that of a lot of kinship with British post-liberalism, has been more and more in this nationalistic direction, like Herzoni and so on. And our objection to this is that actually worshipping the sovereign nation state is part and parcel of liberalism from the outset. That you need a totally single monopolized central sovereignty to keep order if you assume individualism. This is Hobbesian, the Hobbesian point. And okay, liberalism can sort of tend towards a kind of Kantian world governance, sort of Bill Gates thing. But it can also tend in the direction of insisting that only the nation state can guarantee order. And in fact, it's more naturally biased in that direction because of the sheer degree of powers of the nation state that can't be replaced. But it seems to me liberal to think in terms of simply a neo-Westphalian so-called realist competition between the nations. And that is certainly rejected by British post-liberals by and large. Right. By and large, I would, there are some complications there. And it's not even realistic, because in reality, what we have are big civilization nations that are much more like imperial blocs. Right. And I think that's another sort of distinction between a British and an American. The America is born out of rejecting empire, if you like. Whereas I think the British, where they're not in the business of simply an Americanized rejection of their imperial past, would take a more complicated attitude towards that. Reflecting, for example, ever since tribes, history has been mostly empires, and in many ways, nation states are empires in miniature. And some empires may be linked to violent conquest, but they're also linked to attempts to have uniformity of laws or a combination of pluralism and consensus. If you think of something like the Habsburg Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, they're extremely pluralistic, and they didn't assume that top-down government was going to do everything in the way that nation states perhaps do. So that I think British post-liberals very much want to say, the alternatives aren't either this so-called nation-state bilateralist realism on the one hand, or the so-called rules-based, which is a fiction, rules-based international order on the other hand. We need to think in much more Burkean English school IR, international relations terms, of the priority of culture and civilization in international relations, and that trying to keep order and consensus across boundaries is very much to do with cultural exchange and civilizational harmony. So we're probably, more in sympathy with the kind of Catholic wing of post-liberalism that thinks in terms of defense of Western civilization, if you like. Not that we're in, and sees that you do have to be wary about, the relationship to China or the relationship to Islam and so on, without sort of dismissing the idea there are going to be intercultural conversations, but not not having a naive attitude towards the idea that you can simply let in alien influences and it will all work out. Because quite often those alien influences, think of China, think of Islam, very much have their own agenda. And sometimes that's one of trying to colonize and displace our norms. This doesn't mean civilizations can't learn from each other or something like that, but they can't, if they lose their souls, they can't genuinely do that.
Right. Well, that leads me on to the next question, I think, because I've seen a lot of, recently I've seen a lot of attacks or criticisms of the post-liberal approach that you are describing from people who would say perhaps they are more to the right, maybe. That what's the problem is that it's not pragmatic enough. It's not really. I'm thinking of people like John Gray here, but others as well. Like the kind of the post-liberal thinking is saying we actually need to move away from these liberal tendencies, but it's actually the opposites that's the case. We should the whole move away from liberalism is the problem, and so the post-liberalism is itself part of the problem and part of and what we need right now is more like a pragmatic, a kind of national emergency state or something like that. So that the kind of so you have all these criticisms that it's not pragmatic enough for the situation today. I think many people are thinking of the problem of immigration, mass immigration, etc. And how would you have partly already responded a bit to it, but I think it's an interesting question now, that kind of critique of post-liberalism.
Yes, I mean, I feel as if John Gray has been very, very inconsistent. And sometimes he will say, and I think this is true, that liberalism is very much rooted in Western soil, that it is a post-Christian phenomenon, if you like. But if he's going to say that, then he can't really also claim that it's a neutral, universal solution in the face of pluralism, which is more recently what he does seem to be claiming, And he also seems to have retreated to pure Hobbesian liberalism, whereas earlier, I think with greater astuteness, he was much more inclined to say that the Hobbesian solution can't really overcome its assumed war of all against all, and indeed that the solution tends to increase the war of all against all. Hobbes
Kind of wish fulfilling.
begins with the false assumption that we're all totally divided, we're all fearful of each other, we're all isolated from each other. He ignores the primacy of culture. He ignores the primacy of pre-political groupings. But then his remedy, which is to treat us all as isolated contracting units, only joined together by Leviathan and an absolute police force, that tends to create the very so-called natural situation. So the natural situation is a myth, but it's artificially created through the Hobbesian solution. And the more, as I said at the outset, the more, Hobbes, people didn't take Hobbes that seriously, but in effect, the more things have gone on and we have eroded the various intermediary institutions that bind us together, the more it's as if indeed we have Leviathan trying to impose order, but that in itself, I think, tends to foment anarchy. And I feel that there were points in John Gray's earlier work where he was much more wanting to acknowledge that kind of thing. And he's an extraordinarily interesting thinker, but I think because he's ultimately irreligious and ultimately tends to think, well, we just are animals, that he doesn't have, he's not just not religious, but he doesn't have an account of the metaphysical. He doesn't believe that in the reality of soul and spirit, if you like. And I think for that reason, then he's going to fall back upon a version of liberalism. But without any sort of absolute belief in the value of the individual and so on. I don't understand how that mode of liberalism is going to become distinguished from some kind of totally Nietzschean pragmatic approach, or how it would be distinct from saying, well, actually, we need a Caesar. That all we can have is ultra liberalism and rules mediating between complete lack of consensus, and therefore we need something like Trump. And as Michael Linders was saying with us yesterday in the podcast, there's really nothing post-liberal about Trump and the way he's going. And indeed, the more you retreat into the United States, the absolute value of the nation, in the absence of any really strong substantive beliefs, views about how human life should be, what do you fall back on? You fall back on racism. That it becomes basically white America. And it's not an accident that increasingly the right wing in America is going in these very naturalistic directions. And again, that's the trouble. If you start saying we're all just animals, that can be the logical conclusion. We're not a united, equal human race, as Christianity has always said. We're instead a species with different races, different breeds, and some are stronger than others and inherently deserve to flourish more. And the degree to which that kind of thinking is coming back is terrifying. And of course, it also usually involves a return of misogyny. The liberal left has been stupid beyond words to give young white men like yourself the impression that they're inherently very bad and might at least have the decency to be gay or want to be the opposite sex or something like that. And of course, people being what they are, they don't just accept this lying down, and the danger that they will go in precisely the opposite direction, half encouraged by people like Jordan Peterson and people far to the right of Peterson, and we see that is indeed the case, that is exactly what happened. So that it's not just that liberalism is dangerous, but the kind of impure liberalism of group identities that we've seen recently is unbelievably dangerous, and inevitably, by insisting in this left-wing way on identities, being lesbian, being trans, being disabled, and all this, rather than upon human universalism, it's invited the emergence of a right-wing identitarianism, which is inherently much more powerful and much more likely, unfortunately, to prevail.
Right. Well, this I think gets at the heart of the problem, at least for the moment, because you have, on the one sense, this radical leftist, identity politics, and on the right, you have kind of emergent this another form of more racist form of identity politics. Again, you have a sense. It's interesting that you said, the Hobbesian, war of all against all turns out to be kind of racist war of all against all, and that's essentially how the only way to get, for some people, I think, the only way to get a kind of a new renewed culture now and get us out of the problems that we've been to is that you essentially embrace that kind of war, and only the strongest will create the new culture, and I think what you then have a problem for, that's the next question essentially, what you then have as a problem for people who want to do post-liberalism, kind of conveying that vision, is that you have two sides that are they're kind of widening and getting more and more radical, and you can't really align with any of them. You can't really.
No,
Where
I
to go?
think you've put it really uh, really well, and the trouble is that people tend to tilt one way or the other. They might take the point that neither side is wholly a good thing, but they're either kind of more angry about progressivism, or they're more angry about a creeping authoritarianism and racism. I can only say that I think it's incredibly important to resist that tendency to think I must join one band or the other, because they're both making very serious mistakes, and to a degree they're making mistakes which are not exactly the same, or at least complicit with each other, and that it's very important to develop an account of things that is refusing either of those poles, I think.
Right. Yes. I think I think I agree with that. It's just that to really go into it, friends of mine would say to that kind of a version of the Hegelian beautiful soul critique, is that this is the real political fight or war
Yeah.
that's going on, and you have no choice. Essentially, you can't escape it. So, but the whole thing about post-liberalism, as I see it, is that you don't accept the terms of the debate or the war, you could say, or the conflict.
No,
You want to redefine the
but
divide between
the
the right and
challenge
left.
not to be a beautiful soul in the face of that, I take it as a very real one. How do you create a viable political movement? It's very difficult, but I do feel as if, in particular with religious people, they've got a natural tendency to focus on cultural issues and ethical issues, and this can cause them to drift towards the right, with a feeling that maybe capitalism isn't quite right, but it surely can't be the center. And I think this is a total mistake. I think that the center of secularization is precisely capitalism, maybe backs up by state rationalism in a Weberian way, but this is the core of secularity, not culture war stuff. It's secondary to that. But I think it's quite difficult for many Christians to see that, despite the fact that the witness of the New Testament and the Church Fathers is very clearly that Christian ascesis is bound up with social justice. That if you're living a relatively ascetic or moral and spiritual life, that's in part because you don't want to rob people, so that the advocacy of an ascetic life in something like Gregory of Nyssa is intimately bound up with a saying that the rich are always people who are robbing the poor. They're not ambiguous about this. And that you shouldn't go much beyond your material needs is something that they say as adamantly as Karl Marx. So that I do feel that there's an evasion of certain elements of the Christian tradition going on with Christians who want to drift to the rights. And maybe they tend to feel that Christianity favors democracy, but surely not socialism. Whereas I think it's very much the other way around, that Christians have always attacked inequality, but it's not clear that Christians have always thought that majority opinion should prevail. I think an element of democracy and of consensus has always been important, but not necessarily pure democracy. And in that way, again, a certain political conservatism and a certain economic radicalism would be a natural Christian politics. And in my mode of post-liberalism, which I sometimes call kind of Tory socialism, that tends to be the case. But, can you persuade conservative Christians of that? It's extremely difficult. On the other hand, can you persuade left-wing Christians that, actually being pro the family, opposed to euthanasia, taking a fairly hard line, at least on abortion, this is consistent, actually, with an egalitarian view of things and a view of things that doesn't oppress and constrain women. That's an equally hard task, and you can tend to feel one is in a sort of shuttle between the two. I still lean towards the idea that it may be easier in the end to persuade the left, just because I think that the left does see with greater clarity that capitalism and at least in the critical theory tradition, bureaucracy also, that these are inherently problematic things. And I do think there are some signs that the left has started to realize that going extremely woke alienates you from the majority of people who might otherwise vote left. That the whole trans cult is not resonating very much with people at all, and ignoring the problems that come from excessively high levels of immigration is not working very well either. And I would say in Britain there's certain evidence that kind of maybe the high tide of wokery has passed. It's very significant the number of feminists that have backed off from this, sometimes to the extent of drifting to the right, which I think is a mistake. But even with Mamdani in New York, he seemed to be shifting more towards bread and butter issues, more towards cost of living, economic issues, even if he hasn't abandoned the culturally liberal direction agenda. There was, to a certain degree, playing that down. And then also, if you look south of you in Denmark, it does seem as if the Social Democrats are reviving their fortunes by taking a pretty tough line on immigration. In other words, the left's taking seriously cultural identity issues and not assuming that this simply makes you fascist. Whereas, to the contrary, it's probably the sheer homogeneity of Scandinavian society that has allowed it to develop so successfully social democracy, besides having constitutional monarchy, of course, like us. But it's constitutional monarchy is crucial to successful socialism. I mean, people can't really be empiricists if they don't notice that.
Right, that's it's very.
All the more moderate Arab societies are constitutional monarchies.
Right, yeah. And that's also a very Norwegian sentiment, I think.
It siphons something off, and it also kind of allows an area that's not so controversial, but is to do with national development, like the Duke of Edinburgh's awards in Britain, and you no doubt have equivalents. So I've gone off at a slight tangent there, but I do think it's interesting that perhaps in Scandinavia, social democrats are sort of thinking about the cultural preconditions of why social democracy has started to work. And so I think I'm saying maybe it's not totally impossible that people on the left will start to see, and certainly Blue Labour under Maurice Klausmann has made considerable inroads in influencing the Labour Party. Perhaps at the moment, Shabana Mahmood and a kind of reformed Rachel Reeves are getting the message, but maybe rather too late in the day. We're going to have to see. But the deeper remark I would want to make here is that despite what I've said about social democracy, I think in the absence of readily guaranteed economic growth, redistribution has become a great deal harder. So the idea that you have a basically free market economy and then the state qualifies that in nice ways, I think that's no longer a very, very viable sort of left-wing agenda. And we much more need to move to a pre-distributive gender, as a younger Ed Miliband puts it, that we much more need to focus on doing everything in a fair way from the outset, that workers getting fair shares, consumers getting fair deals, economic democracy, firms themselves being more involved in the welfare of their workers, rather than everything being done by the state. So, in other words, I think we need to recover cooperativist, mutualist traditions on the left, combined with an element of corporatism, which has been common to both left and right. So the idea that within unions, guilds, vocational associations, people can achieve a certain overcoming of what Durkheim called anomie. That so this is not nostalgia, but in a modern post-industrial society, identity is not going to come only through locality, but it can come also through working associations, through interest groups, through religion, and so on. So instead of the liberal assumption that you begin with isolated individuals, part of post-liberalism, as I would see it, part of communitarianism, would be recognizing that people already exist in groups. And what that implies, I think, is a greater sharing of sovereignty or rule, a certain kind of pluralism in the English tradition of Lasky and Finnis, but also an element of corporatism that we've seen with both Mos and Durkheim, but also even on the right in Portugal and Brazil, and maybe we shouldn't dismiss all of that totally. In other words, that you need to more formalize the political representation of industry and vocational bodies and so on. If these are part of the very fabric of society, we need to break with the liberal myth that the economic realm is a kind of private realm and the political realm is a totally public realm. We need to recreate in a new way the medieval sense that the social and the political and the economic are all mixed up with each other. We need to use Karl Polanyi's term, we need to re-embed both the economy and the politics in the social order.
Right.
And this would be a much more radical way of thinking. But maybe the more the existing order breaks down and things become anarchic, the more people will turn to modes of local and vocational associations just to protect themselves.
Right.
And maybe what doesn't have to be a totally beautiful soul to imagine that beyond what Gillian Rose called the broken middle, sort of new forms of mediation could truly start to emerge.
Yes, I think you mentioned Denmark. I tend to, my argument sometimes is that, the whole, a lot of these, right-wing movements, parties, kind of tend to disappear once the Social Democrats, Mette Henriksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, once they are kind of just accept the problem of immigration, and then the radical
Yeah.
parties tend to disappear. So in one sense, maybe a kind of post-liberal, more to the left, maybe, than the right, in your case, and maybe, in the case of Røyst, which is a kind of left-wing journal. Maybe that kind of combination of certain elements of pragmatism, or at least conservatism, stricter immigration, while protecting, local institutions and workforce, etc., combined also with a kind of more leftist or left-wing focus on the economy, critique of capitalism, and the tendency to,
Yeah.
these things that might work, since it works in Denmark, it might work also in other places. But I think,
Yeah.
given the global situation at the moment, it's very very hard to find those kind of, things tend to become more and more difficult. And on the question of appealing or persuading, you also have the problem of the secular religious thing with the post-liberalism. In Norway, if one wants to do something, I think it's very important to appeal to both seculars and the religious. And maybe there is a danger. At least some people have said that, at least from the left side. Some friends of mine would be worried that the post-liberal thing is too religious to be something that they could, um, associate with, or back up. How to, appeal to a largely, at least increasingly, in certain countries, secular electorate. So that's part of also the problem, I think.
Yeah, I mean, to go back briefly to what you were saying about Scandinavia, I do think that the statist approach to social democracy is going to be harder to sustain in the future. The whole tax spend model. So I do think that the elements of mutualism, corporatism are going to have to be turned towards. On the question of secularity and religion, I think there are many reflective people who see that there is something like an objectivity of the spiritual sphere, even if they can't quite commit to a religious account of that. On the other hand, I think, if you don't have any religious or metaphysical grounds for believing in the objective reality of the good or the reality of spirit, then the drift towards simply liberal pluralism, live and let live, your values are your values, my values are mine. Yeah, this does seem to be almost inevitable. But I think, to be a bit edgier here, what one can say is that maybe that has become so extreme now that it has run into a crisis. If you get to the position of saying, well, our minds are no different from machines, AI can be the equal to us, or our wills are simply an illusion, and our mind is just some kind of inexplicable epiphenomenon, which almost implies it's not really there. I do think people have a kind of natural revulsion against that. That in our daily speech, we assume people really have free will, that they really have intentions. to some degree, we even assume that the good and the true and the beautiful are objective realities. And I think the more and more secularity plays out, the harder it is to hold to a kind of George Eliot or even Iris Murdoch kind of agnosticism. And the more somehow the religious outlook tends to be on the side of common sense. In other words, once it becomes clear that if the whole of the cosmos is not meaningful, there isn't meaning in your ordinary conversations either. And I could be wrong about this, but I think Gen Z, or Z as they say across the pond, is implicitly thinking that. Is thinking, look, everything can't be meaningless. And I'm now being told that the most immediate things in my life are completely meaningless, and I just don't buy this. And I do think this is why, perhaps part of the reason why we're seeing a sudden religious revival. It's not just that a mask for a drift to political nationalism or racism. I think there's something in the case of boys, or sacralizing green politics in the case of girls. I think it's more than that is going on.
Right. There's actually a debate in the newspapers in Norway on the question of, because there is a kind of a religious revival in Norway, in people are certain younger generations, perhaps of my generation.
In Britain too, in France as well.
Right,
yes.
but the discussion in Norway is there's certain people think that this is because of the left wing thing, that people are returning to Christianity because of a kind of worry that what really happens if you really leave it behind. And there's others who make the opposite argument. No, it's actually a kind of traditionalism that is going.
Yeah, I think both things are happening at once.
Yeah, I think so as well.
To put it simplistically, there's a sort of gender divide there.
But, yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. No, okay, it's really interesting. I wanted to. I think this is really interesting, and because a lot of these kind of post-liberal things kind of resonates, I think, with certain elements of already the kind of Norwegian political sensibility. The sense of that you have to have, you have to protect, local traditions, but you can't do. They can't from the bigger market, etc., etc. And people tend to be a little bit left on economic issues, but you also so that kind of combination is not completely alien in one sense in Norway, even though the term liberal is not that.
I think more reflective young people see that somehow secularity just can't mediate between the local and the global. That the global just becomes something completely empty, soulless, and then the local becomes something rather atavistic and dangerous if you don't have this religious sense that what is universal is the transcendent, unknown God or absolute, that different localities and cultures mediate in various different and fragmentary ways that may all have their value up to a certain point. So that there again, it does seem to be that religion better handles that and is better able to mediate. Just as I think religion deals better with our sense that there are forces out there that we're not entirely in control of. That again, without religion, you tend to moralize everything, and everything is your fault, basically. Ironically, it becomes much more moralistic.
Right, that's very interesting. I think you talked about that before. I think maybe I told you about this, but that will lead me to maybe. I have a couple of questions left, but the next question is on the other side of at least the Norwegian sensibility, which is of course, at least since Ibsen, Nietzsche. The sense of, on the one hand, vitalism, but also on another sense, kind of harsh, the climate perhaps, and the Norwegian climate and weather tends to make people like Nietzsche a bit appealing, at least to certain factions of of the Norwegian culture, and certain Nietzscheans would argue that actually the religious Christian religion has kind of exhausted itself, and that it's actually now just a part of what we are seeing. This kind of liberal or neoliberal, nihilist, secular world is actually just the logical outcome. That kind of the secular is kind of the logical outcome of Christianity, and that therefore you have to kind of, if you want to do something new, you have to kind of transcend Christianity. You have to kind of break with it. And I know some people who are kind of, drawn to that. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on that kind of way of understanding Christianity as itself, liberalism, or the part of, what made this kind of individualism, this kind of bad individualism possible.
Yeah, well, that's the argument, that Christianity is somehow inherently half secularizing. It's a disenchanting reality. It's having a cult of the will, and a cult of desire, and so on. What can one say in the face of that? I think one has to insist that to wish to return to the pagan, and to a paganism, a much more naked kind of naturalistic paganism, is to want to return to a simple worship of power and force and violence. And we've already seen that. We already know absolutely the outcome of that. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that Christianity is disenchanting. I mean, maybe it had a much stronger sense of the distance of God, and the need for God himself to arrive in the world in order to save us. But also, at least in one version, maybe one truer version of Christianity, to transform and permeate the world, to thereby re-enchant the world, so that it becomes a kind of maximum of mediation, including the mediation of the incarnation of God himself sacramentally. So, this is a much more Catholic vision, and an almost panentheistic, if you like that word, Catholic vision. I don't really like it, but let's put it that way for the moment. Which I think is the real central Christian vision from Origen onwards, despite all the confusion. So I don't think that Christianity is abolishing enchantment. I do think that it is combining it with a much stronger sense of the personal and the individual. That we absolutely share a common nature, and we're equal in a common nature, but as persons we're unique individuals, and this reflects ideas about the Trinity. It reflects Christology also, where we're united by nature, but also by the different personal ways in which we try to participate in the personality of Christ. So that somehow at the core of Christian doctrine, there's some kind of balance between personhood and nature. Can I put it that way? And sort of nature is magical and the personal is very ethical and responsible, and it's about both those things. It's both Oriental and Western, if you like to put it that way. The Russians are not totally wrong about this, I think. It's that kind of rich synthesis, and this is surely more appealing than the Nietzschean, the postmodern Nietzschean idea that everything is really meaningless, but that we can sort of celebrate life and vitality and beauty. In fact, it's not even consistent to do that if you have this view of a meaningless cosmos. And in terms of your literature house and all of that, I think it's incredibly noticeable that when I was younger, there was a big dominance of literary studies, and it had all kind of gone Nietzschean and postmodern, and eventually that has vanished, in favor of something much more brutally scientific. That once you've said that meaning is totally in flux, and so forth, you basically said meaning is an illusion. And so this kind of anti-humanist humanism was never going to survive. It didn't survive for very long. It quickly gave way to a much harsher kind of speculative realist or materialist metaphysics. And because of that, English, or the study of literature, then stopped. It doesn't really exist any longer.
Really?
It doesn't exist. No. Well, not in the Anglosphere.
Okay.
I mean, English departments are admitting almost nobody.
Interesting.
And it's the whole discipline has collapsed, and very few people are doing it. The energy is just not there any longer. And so the next remark is the only people who are doing it are people who are in literature and theology. That but apart from boring stuff about how every work of the past is racist, sexist, anti-trans, colonialist, and so forth. Apart from reading every work of literature with crossing it out, and the occasional take now and again, apart from that sort of thing, and maybe some good historicist studies still of an old-fashioned kind, but apart from that, there isn't. The only theory is going on with people who are doing something like literature and theology. In other words, the only way to salvage the postmodern sense of the indeterminacy of meaning is to kind of go Christian Platonic, which is basically the radical orthodoxy move. It's been sort of made in relation to poetics, but I think you can see other examples of that as well. But the postmodern insight, the post-structuralist insight, is either unbearable or bound to be self-dissolving in relation to the study of literature. And it can, but it can't then be salvaged in a humanist direction. You can't, because people like Foucault had done their work well enough for us to be able to see that that's impossible. Or Nietzsche, that man in capital letters is definitely just the image of God. So the only way then to restore a literary theoretical discourse is to revert indeed to the idea of the primacy of the divine and participation in the divine.
Well, so that's a very interesting and encouraging thought, because as I understand you, maybe that's a response to the kind of Nietzschean sensibility of our time, is to say that actually what you want in Nietzsche, the kind of vitalism and the beauty, is actually not there if you follow that. And actually where you want that kind of re-enchanting and that kind of vitalism, that kind of Christianity is actually the real vitalism.
Completely.
Show that, I think.
Completely, because if you read Origen and Gregory of Nyssa, the reason they believe in universalism is they say things like, in the end, growth will defeat evil. In other words, that not simply willing to be good, but in the end, growth will defeat evil, because life is not evil. You don't get growth out of evil. You don't get it. It's positivity, and evil is negative and predatory. Therefore, in the end, it is defeated by life.
Right.
I mean, that's part of the argument.
Yeah. Reminds me of Charles Péguy's, kind of philosophy and poetry of the spring of everything, returning to a kind of eternal spring. He talks about that in many of his poems. Well, okay. The last question.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The last question is more of perhaps a fun question, more kind of. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Røyst, the journal, had arranged a philosophy festival last summer, and we had a debate on Plato and the role of philosophy and the philosophers in a future polity. So my friend, who was also in the journal, Émile Perron, he was kind of anti-Plato. He took that role, and I defended Plato's kind of sense that philosophers should actually be part of governing some version of that kind of thinking. And I think, do you have any thoughts on, if you want to renew philosophy and the role of the philosopher in the future, how would you conceive that today? Should we go with a kind of new Plato version of things?
In relation to the philosopher-king kind of idea?
Yes, or the idea of some kind of philosopher should engage in politics and should be very much part of things, or in kind of contrast to a Schopenhauerian solitude or something like that, that kind of.
Yeah, it's a really important question. I suppose that to a degree in Indian tradition, you get the idea that the wise man exceeds politics and doesn't return to political concerns. But at least in some forms of Neoplatonism, I mean, in Plato himself, it seems to be an aporia that, the wise person will not want to contaminate himself with politics, but we need the wise person to have a role in politics, just like, only the reluctant monk should become a bishop or something like that. But I think in particular with the theurgic Neoplatonists, you had more of a sense that the completeness of wisdom involves some kind of return to the political, more of a bodhisattva idea that the fully wise person is also assisting people as part of his wisdom and maybe dialectically part of his learning process, that should be involved in teaching, should be involved in governing, should be involved in the life of the city. But I think you could maybe say that, healthy societies, whether we're thinking about Buddhism, Islam, or Christianity, have definitely had this sense that there are monastic spaces or spaces of learning that are linked to spiritual contemplation, and that these have a critical function in relation to normal society, but even should be consulted, should be partly engaged, and we know this can kind of go wrong with Rasputin and stuff like that. That was Russia in the end of the story. But nonetheless, I do think it's very important that the people who are looking beyond this world should have some role in guiding this world. And it can even be connected to kingship, certainly in the case, I think, of King Charles, because he hasn't sort of had to earn his position, but then he does have some sense that that a king should be looking to ultimate values and reminding people of that kind of thing. And I think that's true with the church. It's true with universities, and certainly my idea of post-liberal politics is that it is a politics of virtue. In other words, that the very purpose of politics should be to make people virtuous, in the sense of ensuring their flourishing, so that politicians need to be people trained in wisdom and virtue, and they are in turn sort of trying to inculcate that, a sense, if you like, that any society or state is a school in some sense, a certain kind of priority of education over politics, of paideia, a sense of paideia, I think. Yeah. So clearly, this for me is very central. But in the end, I'm definitely a Platonist, and I take Aristotle to be a Platonist, and when he's not a Platonist, to be in need of correction.
Right.
And so I'm very much of the opinion that philosophers and theologians have a political role to play. I mean, I think if they leave philosophy and theology and go into power, they might be extremely dangerous. But that they should be informing politicians, and that they have some sort of background role to play. And the question here of, I would not abolish the House of Lords. I would extend its representation of vocations and of the wise, have represent the major faiths, not remove the bishops, because they represent major groups, and represent universities, and this kind of thing. Which might be one practical way of the involvement of the philosopher-king figure.
Right. So maybe if everything falls apart, and the conflicts, the global conflicts turn for the worse, perhaps one can try to create these smaller philosopher communities.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, in relation to strategy, you probably need some mix of staying involved in decaying institutions and sometimes trying to craft alternatives. I mean, I certainly think in relation to theology and other subjects, we may have to look beyond the university, for example. The universities are just getting rid of certain subjects, and things like theology, but also music. And for them, Nottingham, for example, is recently. And we may have to think of other kind of institutional formations. Given the internet and so on, we don't necessarily need the university for everything. But it's not a question of necessarily abandoning the university, but that's just one example of the way I think we have to have some kind of mixed strategy, not a complete Benedict option, but some elements of that. Yeah.
Right. No, I think this might be a good place to wrap up. We've talked about post-liberalism, what it means, in at least in your vision, why it matters today, why it's absolutely relevant, and where it might take us in the future. And we've also talked maybe a bit about how it can be appealing through how we can talk, appeal to a new sensibility with Christian vitalism and philosophy, how to renew those. Do you have anything you wanted to add to this, or?
I don't think so. Thanks, Eric.
No, and again, thank you so much for joining us and helping us.
No, thank you. Thank you.